Hey everyone, I want to talk a little bit about this book. Now, I'm cleaning this book for a customer, and it has some deep scarring in it. So if you look down this corner right here, you'll see that there's some deep scratches, like someone was trying to get a pen to work maybe on a piece of paper above it. Same up here, there's a lot, and I've pressed it once. It's going to require a lot of pressing to make it flat, but it's an interesting book I wanted to go over a little bit because it was published, and you can determine about mid-1958. It says Explorer, Vanguard, Sputnik. What are they and why have they been rocketed into space? This is their story. Now, it's pretty fun read, actually, especially with, the historical hindsight. Now, look here. The first thing we see is this is a Jupiter C rocket. Look how tiny it is. And they say that this big rocket, they're getting us all excited. And there's guys on the ground crew here fueling it. There's a truck. Sirens going off. There's light. Everything to make it exciting. But, if they could only have seen a Saturn V in 10 or 11 years, they would have been, is nothing, right? So they talk a little bit about what the stages of rockets are and all the different people that are involved and all kind of action that might happen to this rocket. And they give just a little bit of time to Sputnik. Oh, they talk about the fueling and the nozzles. And this is fun for me because I used to work in the space industry before. So it's particularly fun for me. They talk about the heights of the atmosphere. They say most meteors disintegrate here in the ionosphere. They talk about how the atmosphere protects us from cosmic rays. And a lot of this stuff, just remember, no one had ever done this stuff before. This was super exciting, thrilling, and this was the only way a lot of kids had to learn about it besides radio and sometimes shorts at the movie theater. So they talk about rockets going up and the stages are and how they're wrapped. There's a lot of science here, actually. It says the second stage, which is wrapped around the third stage, is a cluster of 11 Sargent rockets burning solid fuel. And it says thiacol particles, saltpeter particles. It's pretty cool. It's really cool. It's just a fun book, and they talk a little bit about the physics and what's happening. I really enjoy this more than a lot of people would, I think. The last stage has to go over 18,000 miles an hour or we've failed, it says, which sounds super fast at the time, right? Now, it's interesting. They don't give a lot of time to Sputnik. They don't mention it at all, but what they do say is, this is fun, the satellites of today. Now, the satellites of today, so Explorer was launched in 1958, in January 31st, 1958. But satellite of today is January 1958. The last Sputnik was actually the first dog in orbit was only November 1957, and the first Sputnik was October. We're only talking a few months after the Sputniks, but it says like satellites of today. They're not like those ones of yesterday. So it's pretty interesting how they mention that. And then they talk about here now when this was written, both Sputniks had come down already. I mean, the second one I think came down No, the first one had come down in January. I think the second one was still up until April. But, well, obviously the dog had died, unfortunately, but it didn't come down until April with the dog's body in it. However, they talk about the orbit of the Explorer 1. Now, Explorer 1 hadn't come down yet during this time. Explorer 1 wouldn't come down until, I think, March of 1970, which was really cool. And Vanguard was the next American satellite. That was actually launched in March. The Vanguard satellite wouldn't decay is still up there and won't decay until 2198. There's a 240-year orbital lifetime. So Vanguard's still up there. And so that's pretty cool. I mean, that's a interesting thing to consider, I think, reading this. So it's pretty neat how deep they go into the science in this. They actually talk about the coatings. They talk about lathing. The two halves are welded together. Metallic H-shell is only 19 thousandths of an inch thick. They literally lathe the shell of this thing apart. And it's fascinating. It's a fascinating read. They talk about miniaturization. These guys are electroplating. I guess it's an electroplating. There's no safety stuff like in this dude at all. And they say, it's been plated several times. First a layer of pure gold, then coatings of magnesium, aluminum, transparent silicon monoxide, hand polished until it gleams like a jewel. This increases its visibility to make visual tracking easier in space. And then they talk about miniaturizing. And this part reads, assignment: reduce these two matchbox size yet without losing any power. These big computers, and they go, good grief, what do they think we are, magicians? And then they talk about miniaturizing stuff. They say we need miniature batteries, miniature electric motors, transformers, radio transmitters. They talk about a Geiger counter for cosmic rays, normally weighs 40 pounds, reduced down to 3 inches. They talk about a complete radio transmitter would fit into a lady's handbag, which is, of course, no trick today. A complex spectrometer for measuring radiations from the sun can hang by a thread without breaking it. So they're saying it's very light. It's really cool. It's just a fun little trip down through history and see how it's presented to people. It talks a lot about reflecting cosmic rays and radiation, and it talks about how tiny they are, and it's just fun to see how much information they're sharing at the time in an era where they weren't as afraid, I guess, to share stuff like that. And it's a great, fun book that talks a lot about Earth science, and I really appreciate this little comic book for what it is. And Walt Disney did a lot of stuff like this at the time. I have some cartoons on my channel too that Disney did in the 50s about all kinds of stuff, and it is these are fascinating books, and I'm very glad that to have really, it is an honor to be able to read this. I have to return this to a customer, but this one is definitely close to my heart.